Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be diving into something you've probably heard of, but maybe not fully grasped.
Okay.
Technology Readiness Levels, or TRLs for short.
Got it.
That scale that's used to kind of figure out how close an invention is to actually like hitting the market.
Right.
The thing is, TRLs can be deceptively tricky.
Yeah.
And actually, in the research that you sent over, there was an article about an investor who almost lost millions
Oh, wow.
because they misunderstood the TRL of a battery tech startup.
Oh, interesting.
So that's exactly what we're going to be unpacking today, why TRLs can be so misleading and what other readiness levels you should be watching out for.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like looking at a picture of, say, a futuristic carbon capture system, right?
Yeah.
And trying to just guess, like, how long until it's, on factory rooftops. Even experts can disagree wildly on the TRL.
Right. And it's kind of like in that YouTube video that you shared. Remember, people guessed all over the place for the TRL of that fermentation process that turns CO2 into ethanol.
Yes.
So why is that? Like, why is it so hard to pin down?
Well, it's because a TRL rating doesn't just, like, magically appear.
Right.
Um, it's based on a whole bunch of factors that are, that are open to interpretation.
Hmm.
You need deep knowledge, not just of the tech itself, but like its entire roadmap to market.
I see.
TRLs. They were originally developed by NASA back in the 1970s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And they had just 7 levels back then.
Okay.
And things like, just the word prototype were really loosely defined,
Hmm.
which led to a lot of confusion.
Right.
So they extended it to the 9 levels that we mostly use today.
Okay, so even with more levels, there's still room for subjectivity, and it just
Man.
seems like a recipe for trouble.
Exactly, yeah. Different organizations even kind of, tweak the TRL definitions to fit their needs.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the U.S. Department of Energy and BARC in India, they both have their own, their own spin on it
Hmm.
to fit their own specific needs.
So telling an investor, hey, this is TRL6 might not mean what they think it means.
Oh, yeah, that's right. That could be, like, disastrous.
Right.
Yeah, the investor hears TRL6, and they're thinking, oh, okay, 2 years to market.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the developer's over here knowing it's more like 5 years, considering all the hurdles specific to that tech.
Ouch.
Yeah.
So TRLs, it seems like they're important, but they can't be the whole story. So what else should we be looking at?
Yeah, you got it. TRLs mostly focus on the tech itself, but not like how easy it is to manufacture at scale,
Okay.
or its commercial viability, or whether people will even use it.
Right.
Like, imagine like a lab-perfect cake that falls apart when you try and make like 100 of them.
Uh-huh, right, yeah.
So there are other readiness levels to consider, like manufacturing readiness levels or MRLs.
Okay, so MRLs are all about going from like baking one perfect cake to running a whole bakery.
Precisely. And then you have commercialization readiness levels, or CRLs. Those are about, finding your customers, finding your value proposition, setting up your supply chains,
Okay.
all those things, making sure people actually want your cake and they can get it.
Yeah, they can get it.
Exactly.
And for things like climate type, which could disrupt whole industries, there's another level.
Yeah, that's right. Adoption readiness levels, or ARLs. These highlight barriers to, to getting existing industries on board.
Got it.
Maybe your cake solves world hunger, but like, are people ready to ditch bread?
Yeah.
So ARLs look at infrastructure, cost, performance compared to current solutions, like the whole context.
Okay, so we've got this whole ecosystem of readiness levels. But how do we use them effectively? Like, how do we actually put this into practice?
Well, first, you got to understand the specific TRL framework used by whoever you're dealing with, whether it's, a funding agency or a potential investor.
Okay.
Their definition of, let's say, TRL3 might be totally different from someone else's.
So it's kind of like knowing if your investor prefers chocolate or vanilla before you even start baking.
Exactly, yeah. And equally important is defining what each TRL means for your specific technology,
Okay.
including specific proof points.
Proof points.
Yeah, those are measurable achievements that actually, prove you're hitting those TRL milestones.
Oh, I see, I see. So let's say for that carbon capture tech, a proof point might be capturing a certain amount of carbon per unit area,
Yeah,
or like hitting a specific energy consumption target.
exactly. Clear proof points ensure that everyone's on the same page about what we're talking about.
Right, so it's like, a shared language.
Yeah, exactly. And also remember, your tech doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Right.
You got to consider how it integrates with, like, existing systems. A parting station, needs to connect to the power grid.
Yeah, you can't just assume it'll magically work.
Exactly, and be realistic about the time and resources needed for TRL assessment and progression. It's not a quick process.
Right.
Yeah, this is a lot to keep track of.
It is. It is a lot to keep track of. Any other tips to kind of avoid getting lost in the weeds here?
Absolutely. First, remember, TRLs are valuable but imperfect.
Okay.
They're one piece of the puzzle, right?
Right.
So don't be afraid to consult experts to help, assess your tech, spot potential risks.
Got it.
And remember, TRL assessment can be subjective. Researchers, they might be overly optimistic, while industry folks might be too cautious.
Mm.
Get diverse perspectives.
So it's kind of like getting feedback from, bakers and taste testers and even customers.
Precisely. Yeah. Open communication is key. But one final thing. Remember that TRLs can change.
You mean like realizing halfway through you need a bigger oven?
Exactly. Exactly. As your tech evolves, you might need to recalibrate your TRLs. It's a very dynamic process.
This has been incredibly insightful. We've learned that TRLs are, a useful but imperfect tool. But before we move on to the next part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with a question.
Okay.
If TRLs can be so subjective, are there ways to make the assessment process more objective, or at least more consistent? What are some best practices for minimizing that subjectivity? We'll explore this further in just a bit. Welcome back. We were just discussing how subjective those TRL assessments can be.
Right.
Are there ways to, I don't know, make them more objective, maybe like best practices for keeping things consistent?
Yeah, that's a really key question. One way is to have, super clear definitions for each TRL level,
Okay.
tailored to, the specific industry or tech area that you're in.
So instead of just saying TRL4 means like a lab scale prototype,
Yeah.
you'd like specify the exact performance, testing, and documentation
Yeah.
needed for a TRL 4-inch, say, carbon capture.
Exactly. The more specific you are, the less room there is for interpretation and bias.
Makes sense.
Another strategy is using independent experts or third parties for those assessments.
Oh, okay.
They can offer a more, neutral view.
So it's like having a panel of professional judges instead of just asking your mom if she likes your cake?
Precisely. And of course, meticulous documentation is vital.
Right.
That paper trail of development, test results, and so on, that really backs up your TRL claim.
Got it. So it's not just like, oh, trust me, it's a TRL 5.
Right, exactly. But even with all of that, some human judgment will always be involved.
Right.
The key is just being aware of that subjectivity,
Okay.
encouraging open communication, and, being ready to revisit those TRLs as needed.
Okay. Got it. So TRLs are kind of a tool, not a rigid rule book.
Exactly, yeah.
But let's say we've done our due diligence and we believe that, a technology has real potential.
Yeah.
What are some practical tips for using TRLs to actually guide its development?
First, remember, TRLs aren't static. They're a dynamic tool to track progress and inform decisions throughout that whole development. Kind of like, checking on a cake while it's baking to make sure it's cooking properly.
Okay, that makes sense. What other tips do you have?
Don't be afraid to iterate.
Okay.
Tech development rarely goes in a straight line. Expect setbacks, expect surprises, new insights. Just like sometimes you need to adjust the oven temperature or add a bit more flour to the batter. You got to be flexible, adapt, and don't hesitate to revise your TRL assessments.
Okay, so speaking of revisions, document those carefully. This helps kind of track the progress,
Yes.
spot areas for improvement, and just communicate with all the stakeholders.
Exactly. It's like keeping a detailed baking journal.
So we're really leaning into this baking analogy.
I know, it works. Another really important point is involving multiple perspective in the assessment.
Okay.
Don't just rely on, the engineers or the scientists.
Right.
Get feedback from, all sorts of people like marketing people, potential users, even industry regulators.
Yeah.
Different viewpoints give you a much more complete, realistic picture of the tech's maturity.
It reminds me of that article that you sent about a medical device that was like technically brilliant, high TRL, but it failed because nobody asked the nurses how they'd actually use the thing in a busy hospital.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Diverse input is critical. And lastly, remember, TRLs are for communication. They're not for, shutting down conversations.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Sometimes people use TRLs to, dismiss ideas like, oh, that's only TRL3, forget it. But even, low TRL tech can have huge potential.
Right, right.
Every amazing cake starts with a simple recipe. So use TRLs constructively to foster dialogue, encourage collaboration, and guide that whole tech's development journey.
This has been, yeah, incredibly insightful. But before we go to the final part of our deep dive, where we'll be exploring some specific examples, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought-provoking question. Imagine you're an investor and you're looking at a potential opportunity. Would a high TRL alone convince you to invest, or would you look beyond the TRL at other factors? We'll unpack that after a short. We'll unpack that right now. We were just talking about TRLs in the context of investment, and
Yeah.
if you were an investor, would a high TRL alone convince you to invest?
Well, I think, it's tempting to think so, right?
Right. Yeah.
But a savvy investor knows there's a lot more to it than just a shiny TRL number.
So what else would be on your checklist?
Well, first and foremost, market demand.
Okay.
Does the world actually need this technology? Are there customers out there who are actually willing to pay for it?
Right.
I mean, even the most advanced technology is useless if nobody wants it.
Yeah, it's like baking a perfect cake that nobody wants to eat.
Exactly. And then you have the competitive landscape, right?
Yeah.
Are there similar technologies already out there?
Okay.
And if so, what makes this one stand out? What's its unique advantage?
Right. So even if your cake is delicious, are there a dozen other bakeries selling the same thing cheaper?
Right, exactly. And don't forget about the regulatory landscape.
Mm-hmm.
Are there legal hurdles or policy hurdles that could trip things up?
Okay.
Approvals, permits, safety regulations,
Right.
all that stuff, those can make or break a technology's success.
Yeah, that red tape can be a real headache.
Oh, absolutely. And then there's the team behind the tech.
Okay.
Do they have the expertise, the experience to actually execute their plan?
Got it.
Are they passionate, driven, adaptable?
So you can have a great recipe, but if the baker's inexperienced, the cake might flop.
Precisely. And of course, the financials have to be sound right.
Right.
What's the projected return on investment? What are the funding needs? Is this a sustainable business model?
So even a delicious in-demand cake needs to be profitable to make and sell.
Investing isn't just about the tech itself.
Yeah.
It's about looking at the whole picture.
Right.
The market, the team, the regulations, the financials.
Hmm.
TRLs are just one data point in a much larger equation.
This has been incredibly insightful. We've learned about, the nuances of TRLs, their strengths and weaknesses, and how to use them effectively, not just in, technology development, but also in investment decisions.
Yeah, and hopefully we've encouraged our listeners to think beyond just the TRL
Absolutely.
and consider that broader context.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, is there any final wisdom you'd like to share with our listeners who are out there navigating the world of innovation?
I would say stay curious, ask questions, and don't be afraid to challenge assumptions.
Okay.
TRLs and other readiness levels are tools.
Right.
They're there to help us understand and evaluate these new technologies,
Yeah.
but they're not the be-all and end-all. The
Right.
most important thing is to think critically engage with diverse perspectives and never stop learning.
Fantastic advice. Thank you so much for guiding us through this fascinating deep dive into the world of TRLs.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We'll be back next time with another insightful exploration of the topics that matter to you. Until then, keep seeking knowledge and keep asking those thought-provoking questions. CAC 8A.